Hello, back to Energy 101, and today we are looking at electric power plant capacity factor. This is another major characteristic we need to study and be aware of when we're dealing with utilization of electricity from the grid. And essentially, I don't know, 99% or more of our electricity comes from the grid. That's basically a pool that has many power plants feeding into it: renewable energy photovoltaics, renewable energy wind generators, hydroelectric dams, nuclear, coal plants, gas plants. They all feed into the same grid. And then at the other end, we pull out some electricity, and the power plants are turned on and off and up and down to meet our demand. So, but the demand varies, and so what does the demand that's placed on the grid that the utility servicing the grid and managing the grid has to deal with? Well, time of day is an obvious one. The peak demands, peak electricity usage is during the day, and the lowest is at night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Most factories are closed down, office buildings are closed down, homes are closed down, people are asleep, and so the electricity usage is low. Temperatures are low, by the way, and therefore even air conditioners are lower than the daytime in the south, for instance, summertime, so the air conditioners are unloaded even. But it also changes by day of week that you might not think of at first, because weekdays, Monday through Wednesday, have a higher demand and have a different profile than weekend, Saturday and Sunday. So the utilities have to be prepared to operate differently on Saturdays and Sundays and weekend days than during the weekdays, Monday through Friday. But they also vary in another major way, and that is over longer term by seasons. The winter and summer have a higher demand than the fall and spring. And of course, the reason for that is the fall and spring have a low heating need for the space heating. When the temperatures are 70 degrees or are fairly comfortable outside, we have to provide less space heating for our buildings and our homes than we do in the winter. And in the summers, we have to provide air conditioning in the summers for space conditioning. Fall and spring, we don't have to supply as much air conditioning. So you have variations, short-term variations from hour to hour in the day, daily variations from day of week, and seasonal variations with winter, summer, fall, spring. So the utility managing the grid has to deal with all of these ups and downs and be able to meet the highest demand that people ask for when they turn something on, and they also have to throttle things down when the demand is low, because there's no electrical storage system. Electrical storage is very expensive and isn't commercially viable at this point. Hopefully it will be in the future, but electricity can only be generated as people use it. So everything's got to match up. Let's look at this a little more closely, and before we do that, we need to look at some definitions. Power capacity of a power plant or a fleet of power plants, either way, is the maximum steady power production capability, maximum being they're running wide open as they're designed to do. It's not like a car trying to run it wide open 120 miles per hour, and you probably can't do that very long before you damage something in a lot of cars. But this is industrial equipment that are designed to operate with maximum rated power in steady state for days or months on end. That's the maximum capacity, or what we call the power capacity. Now that's like speed on your speedometer. In other words, it's measured in megawatts, which we denote by MW, and or kilowatts, which is denoted by kilowatts. Of course, a megawatt is 1,000,000 watts, and kilowatt is 1,000 watts. and that's the rate at which we're using the energy, like miles per hour in your car. And we denote the maximum capacity that the power plant or the fleet of power plants, if it's to look at all of them feeding into the grid, we denote that by MW capacity, subcapacity, or kilowatt subcapacity, just depending on whether you want, which units you want. One's just 1,000 different than the other. So that's the power capacity that, and that needs to be, of course, higher, a little bit higher than the maximum demand that the system will ever see. Otherwise, we have blackouts and brownouts, and equipment gets overloaded, and the system falls apart. But another definition that we like to look at is the electrical energy production. That's comparable, using the speed analogy in a car, to the miles analogy. It's the power that we're using times the time we use it that gets us the energy used, that determines how much fuel we got to put in, and how long we have to run the plant, and how hard we have to run the plant. So in other words, it's the electrical energy used, typically we always say over 1 hour. So it's measured in megawatt hours, MW hours, or kilowatt hours, KW hours. And that gives us the amount of energy that is used over some period of time. And for capacity factor, we generally look at a whole year. So the annual load factor is determined by looking at the annual electrical energy production over a year, is denoted by megawatt hours per year or kilowatt hours per year. Typically megawatt hours per year, because there's a lot of kilowatt hours that are produced over a year, even by one power plant. So those are the basic definitions. Moving further on definitions, what are the capacity factor, which is the whole point here to discussing, is defined as the megawatt hours that is produced in 1 year, and this is for one power plant. If you look at the capacity factor of a power plant, or it's for a whole fleet of power plants feeding into the grid, you can do it nationally, you can do it for just a region or one utility one part of the grid that is under control by one utility. And that is divided by the megawatts capacity that the power plants are capable of producing if they're run wide open, times 8,760 hours. Now, what's the 8,760 hours? Well, 8,760 hours is the number of hours in a year. So, in other words, if the denominator is the number of megawatt hours that the power plant or fleet of power plants could produce if they ran wide open at rated maximum capacity for every hour of the year. So that's what the denominator is. The numerator is, of course, the actual amount that is produced. So the number is always less than 1, due to the fact that the capacity's got to be equal to the maximum demand put on the system over the entire year, and at most periods of the year and hours of the year, the demand is going to be less than that. So it's not producing fully every hour of the year, so the numerator was going to be less than the denominator. So it measures electricity produced as a fraction of the electrical energy it could have produced by running maximum output every hour of the year. So that's the definition of the capacity factor. By the way, let me note here that there's also a term that some of you might be familiar with called load factor. And in the load factor definition, it's a small difference, hopefully small in most cases. The denominator is not megawatt capacity, but the peak load seen throughout the year. And the power plant capacity needs to be slightly greater than the maximum load that the system or power plant ever sees during the year, in order to, say, 10% higher, in order to maintain control of and be able to keep from going unstable for stability purposes. So some nuances there, but capacity factor and load factor are very similar, except the capacity factor will always be a little bit lower than the load factor because you use megawatt peak demand during the year rather than the megawatt capacity of the system. So let's look at an example here. Well, let's take a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power plants, I picked that one because that one has the largest, highest capacity factor. And take a large 2-unit, typically they're built in 1,000 megawatt units, and if you take a 2-unit nuclear plant that has a capability of producing 2,000 megawatts on a continuous basis, that's the capacity. And let's assume that you measured the actual output of that plant over the year, and it was 15 million megawatt hours. That's the actual energy that's produced. But it could produce how much? It could produce 2,000 megawatts times times 8,760 hours. That's what it could have done, but it actually did 15 million. Well, if you run the numbers out, I believe you get an 86% capacity factor. Well, that's a high capacity factor, but in fact, nuclear plants typically run about 90%. And there's several reasons for that, but well, number one, it shows the reliability. The maintenance, they're down for maintenance around 10% of the time. And that's scheduled maintenance. You hopefully don't have unscheduled maintenance, particularly in a nuclear plant, but you may have. As any plant may have some unscheduled maintenance where something goes wrong and that you weren't prepared for and didn't expect. If you expected it, you replaced that part or did the maintenance during the annual maintenance period when you take the plant down for maintenance. So nuclear plants are pretty well base loaded. The fuel cost is very low compared to fossil fuels, and therefore they can run them if they've already got them built and they want to run them rather than running a coal-fired or gas plant where they have to buy fuel for it. But if you look at the U.S. fleet as a whole, if you take the entire capacity of all power plants in the U.S. and add them together and divide that into the annual megawatt hours that are produced and used in the country, then you come out with a 40 to 50% capacity factor. Now, what that means is, and this is my whole point here, is that only about less than half of the U.S. power plant capacity is used at any one point in time. On the average, on the average. Over the average over a year, we're utilizing half of or less of the power plant capacity. Sometimes it's 20, 30%. Other times, or a few hours normally, it's like 90%. But over average, so it's only 40 to 50. So we got a lot of excess capacity except during the peak hours in the year, which normally occurs during the hottest afternoons, late afternoons in the summer when there's a very large air conditioning demand. That's generally when your annual peak will occur. So let's look at power plant dispatching. So how does the utility that has this fleet of power plants that they can turn up and down like throttle, like your accelerator on your car, which ones do they throttle back and which ones do they turn on and turn off when they don't need them? You got a big choice there. So which half do you use and which half on average do you throttle down or turn off? Well, you turn on generating facilities that are the cheapest to operate in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. In other words, you've already paid for the capital cost, and so you got to amortize that capital cost over the year, whether it's running or not. That's the fixed cost. It's fixed. The capital cost is fixed. So the incremental cost in dispatching forgets about what the plant costs to build because you've already got the money invested. And so you're now deciding whether to run power plant 1 or power plant 2. And so in both cases, you look at the dollars per megawatt hour to turn it on versus let it sit there and do nothing, and that's basically the fuel cost. So typically, the plants that are turned on first and turned off last will be the ones with the lowest fuel cost. Well, it's pretty obvious that the ones with the lowest fuel cost are the renewable energy, because that's energy is free. So the wind, solar, and hydro is used anytime it's available. And that's, I mean, all you got to do is just look at the reality, and that is typically what happens. There are a few isolated cases where there's some grid limitations and some contracts that happened out in the Northwest a couple of summers ago, I believe, where the grid became overloaded and coming from a certain region, and due to contractual obligations, they actually turned off some wind farms. But that's a very unusual situation. Basically in that same category, though, is nuclear, because not only is the fuel cost for nuclear very low, but also they're much more difficult to turn on and off. You have to turn them up and down very slowly. It takes days to crank up a nuclear plant and turn it down and turn it off. So you have to consider that. Another factor, by the way, and these are second and third order effects, but the other factors that come into play is water usage. In some cases, they got minimum water flows that the plant uses and maximum water flows and things, and depending on what's going on in the river where they're dumping their heat, if they are, then that can come into play. But basically the renewable energy and the nuclear run all the time. That's what we call base load. Next comes coal, because coal has normally been cheaper than gas, and next comes natural gas plants. Now that's recently, in this year, that has changed for the first time in my 35, 40-year history. That natural gas plants have been cheaper, or as cheap to run as coal plants, and so they have actually shut down some coal plants before shutting down gas plants. But that probably won't last too long, because gas prices are already headed back up, and coal is fairly stable at this point. So we expect that the old rule that gas plants, or the natural gas plants, are the first ones to turn off or turn down, will be it has been generally in the past, except in some unique periods or in situations, and probably will continue over the future. So that's how we dispatch the plants. The coal and the coal and gas have switched depending on relative price, and I need to note that, because you can find examples right now that is not the case. But in general, that is the sequence used, and that covers the dispatching. And the one reason that I wanted to do that is regarding where do we get our incremental load from. And it's a major characteristic of electrical power that's fed into the grid, and we're going to discuss the emissions from electric cars, and so you need to know something about where that electricity will come from, as if you put on one car, additional electric card for recharging onto the grid, or put 1 million of them if you got trying to determine how much impact a tax credit will give for a subsidy to get a million new electric cars out there on the system and whatever. So that gives us the background. And one more important characteristic of the electrical power plants that we operate and utilize and depend on every day. Thank you.